Antarctica, the land of the unknown, the mysterious frontier, the uninhabitable land. For all of human existence, no one had traversed the land. Many have tried, many have failed. But one thing was clear for Roald Amundsen. He was going to be the first person to ever reach the South Pole. By the early 1900s, most of the Earth had been visited and mapped, with only one place left to discover, the South Pole, which sits atop Antarctica. For centuries, explorers and navigators questioned the existence of this uncharted territory. The region was called Terra Incognita, or a land unknown. Two brave explorers took on the challenge to be the first to reach the heart of the Antarctic. They were known by the names of Robert Falcon Scott and Roald Amundsen. They were competing against each other to successfully achieve this feat. This resulted in one of the greatest unintentional races of all time, to be the first to break the geological barrier of the South Pole. Robert Falcon Scott was born on June 6, 1868 in Devonport, England. At age 13, he joined the Royal Navy. The Royal Geographic Society took notice of Scott and appointed him to expedition leader of the Discovery Expedition in 1904. This was his first experience with Antarctica, and quickly, he became fascinated by the place. During the expedition, Scott and his team spent their time collecting and testing data, and also discovering more of the unknown land. When Scott came back to England, he became a national hero and started planning for his next expedition. After an attempt by Ernest Shackleton to get to the South Pole failed, Scott decided to take matters into his own hands and started planning for the Terra Nova expedition. The purpose of the expedition was to reach the South Pole and conduct scientific experiments and observations. Scott and his crew planned out this expedition for months. Scott decided to use state-of-the-art motor sledges as far as possible on the Ross Ice Shelf, setting up depots along the way. Siberian ponies would then take over on the glacier, and then the explorers would man-haul their sleds all the way to the South Pole and back. The ship that they used was called the Terra Nova, a ship specialized for icy waters. On November 29, 1910, Scott and his crew, composed of 65 men, 34 dogs, 19 Siberian ponies, and 3 motorized sledges, departed for Cape Evans, Antarctica. When they reached the Ross Ice Shelf on the Antarctic, they received an unexpected telegram that read, "Beg to inform you, Pram proceeding Antarctic, Amundsen." Scott and his team weren't the only ones trying to reach the South Pole first. Amundsen was born on July 16, 1872 in Bourges, Norway. From a young age, he had dreamt of being an explorer. In 1903, he led an exploration to find Canada's Northwest Passage between the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean. During this time, Amundsen and the crew learned from the local Neslik Inuit people about Antarctic survival skills. He learned to use sled dogs for the transportation of goods and to wear animal skins instead of parkas made of wool. After Amundsen returned to Norway after the extensive, grueling expedition filled with sickness and hunger, he decided for more. Amundsen started planning for his lifetime goal, to become the first person to reach the North Pole. Unfortunately, in 1909, the American explorers Frederick Cook and Robert E. Peary claimed to have reached the North Pole. Amundsen then changed his plans and began to prepare for an expedition to be the first person to reach the opposite direction, the South Pole. But he was uncertain to which the public would support him, so he kept this new plan a secret. Amundsen handpicked expert skiers and those who were fit for the expedition. Amundsen would take dogs for their means of transportation on the Antarctic. His crew would set up depots along the planned route to the pole. On June 3, 1910, Amundsen and his crew, composed of 8 men, 100 sled dogs, and 4 sleds, left Oslo, Norway on their ship, Fram. 3 days later, Amundsen informed the crew on the revised plan. He told them that he intended to make a detour to the South Pole. He said to the crew, "If the expedition was to be saved, there was nothing left for me but to try and solve the last great problem, the South Pole." On January 14, 1911, the Fram reached the Bay of Whales on the Antarctic. Both teams started their journeys on the Ross Ice Shelf, which is the largest ice shelf on Antarctica. The Norwegian team started 60 miles closer to the South Pole than the British team, but the path wasn't traversed before, so an unknown crevasse would have been a major inconvenience. On September 8, 1911, the Norwegian team had a false start, as frigid temperatures forced them to head back to their hut. During this time, the British team collected data and conducted experiments at their base across the bay. On October 19, 1911, the Norwegians officially began their expedition to the South Pole. There were lots of close calls on the ice shelf, where the sleds almost fell into hidden crevices that were covered in ice and snow. The British team began their expedition to the South Pole on November 1st, 1911. Quite quickly, the team realized that its ponies and motorized sledges were inefficient. The journeys were exhausting and required endurance to get through the hunger and pain. Frostbite began to be a severe factor in survival. Both teams neared in on the South Pole and both went through many hardships. Finally, on December 14, 1911, Amundsen and his team reached the South Pole. They had finally broken the geological barrier of the South Pole. Amundsen later said, "The area around the pole had fascinated me since childhood, and now I was here at the South Pole. Could anything be more crazy?" The Norwegians set up a tent with a Norwegian flag at the exact location of the pole. 3 days later, they began their journey back to their base on the Bay of Whales. 4 weeks later, on January 17, 1912, the British team reached the South Pole, heartbroken, as they realized they were beaten to their lifetime goal. By this time, the Norwegian team had almost returned to the Bay of Whales. On the British team's return trip back to their starting point, they started to go through consecutive days with temperatures reaching negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit, which isn't survivable at a long exposure. The first man collapsed and died after suffering major damages to his head after falling on the glacier. The second man sacrificed himself to a blizzard after his injuries started holding back the team's progress. The last 3 died after being trapped in a tent by a snowstorm. Scott's final journal entry wrote, "I do not think we can hope for any better things now. We shall stick it to the end, but we are getting weaker of course, and the end cannot be far. It seems a pity, but I do not think I can write more. For God's sake, look after our people." Amidst the heroic age of Antarctic exploration, 2 courageous individuals took on the challenge of solving the last great problem, the geological barrier of the South Pole. The 2 leaders, Scott and Amundsen, led their own expeditions and raced each other to their hopes and dreams. They used different types of methods for transportation and had different routes. Scott used pony transport while Amundsen used dog sleds. Amundsen started 60 miles closer to the South Pole but was taking a path not yet proven safe. Both endured through grueling conditions on the freezing icy plateau, but in the end, both teams ended up successful in breaking the barrier. They taught the world about the importance of careful preparation and communication. Scott took 5 people in a contradiction to having resources limited to 4 people. The Amundsen-Scott South Pole Station, located at the South Pole, is named after the 2 explorers. Located at the Geographical South Pole, there is currently a sign that has both explorers' names on it. Many people across the world became influenced by their bravery and dedication. Unfortunately, when the British explorers broke the geological barrier of the South Pole, it was the start of an unsuccessful race they didn't see coming, a race to escape the wrath of the freezing Antarctic.